Kalimera.
As if you are.
Good morning, everybody.
Sorry. As if you're a soccer player.
Right.
Here we
Just
are to
before the
start
interview.
all discussions about the conference, reinforcing, transcending, and crossing the borders, soccer in a globalized world. Thanks for coming. Start now, and the discussions will be till tomorrow afternoon. And not to lose any time, I'm inviting Steve Ortega for the opening.
Thank you very much, Kostas. Well, I would really like to thank Olympiacos FC for the event last night. It was inspiring. It was knowledge producing. It was fun. So, thank you very much for that. I should also mention to you, I don't know, for those of you who were not in attendance last night, that we read out a list of principles on the right to participate in sport. So if anybody would like to sign those principles on an online Google Doc, Elizabeth Riley is right here, and you just get into contact with her and she will send them to you. But I want to move on to our first panel, and I'm going to introduce the moderator, Darren Graves. Darren Graves is an associate professor in the education department at Simmons College. He works on critical race theory, race identity development, and urban education studies. He's also an adjunct lecturer at the Harvard Graduate School. The research he's doing right now is on critical consciousness in urban youth. So I'm going to turn it over to Darren now, and he will introduce the panelists. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Thank you. Well, it's an honor to be here this morning. As I've been not shy to tell people, this is literally my first time to Europe ever, and so as a person who loves culture, as a person who loves social justice, as a person who loves football, this could not be a better way for me to have my first introduction to Europe, much less Athens. So I'm very happy to be here. Thanks to Olympiacos FC, our hosts. Thanks to the folks at Harvard at the Weatherhead Center. Thanks to Simmons College. And thanks to the wonderful people of Athens. So I'm here to do the I'm your moderator. I'm here to do some introductions about our presentation today, which is going to look, our first panel looking at citizenship and belonging. I'll do some intros of our panelists. Our presentations will be 20 minutes each. There will be some brief remarks by me. I'll keep them short. And then we will have questions and answers from the audience, and that's how this will go. Sound good? Great. So our first presenter is, and please forgive me if I mispronounce names. My first presenter is Dario Brenton. He is a university assistant at the Center for Southeast European Studies at the University of Graz. Currently, he's also completing a PhD candidate at the School of Slavonic and East European Studies at the University College of London, working on sports and identity in the post-Yugoslav space. He has previously obtained a MAGPhil in political science and Eastern European history at the University of Vienna, and ever since published extensively on the nexus of sports and politics in Southeastern Europe. Our second panelist is Mike Hops. He is the Director of Editorial Services at Development Services Group, DSG Inc., a research firm in Bethesda, Maryland, in the United States. DSG specializes in assessing which programs and practices do and do not work in education, justice, and behavioral health. A longtime journalist, Mike has posts covering environmental affairs and international development. He's also written many magazine and newspaper pieces about sports. He co-wrote and authorized a biography of Walter Camp, the originator of American Rules Football. He cut his editorial teeth as a researcher for National Geographic magazine. Thank you. And our final presenter this morning, Gisbert Unk, is a global historian whose research and teaching activities are in the field of global history, cultural encounters, migration, citizenship, and sport. Gisbert is a project leader of a new research project on history, sport, and nation that has been awarded a prestigious Research Excellence Initiative, REI grant, of 417,000 euros. This interdisciplinary research is titled Sport and National Identity, Changing Citizenship and the Global Battle for Talent. He also supervises a PhD project on football fandom and race, sport in the city, football fandom in Rotterdam, Calcutta, and Bangkok. So these are presenters. We will start off with Dario presenting first, and then we will move on from there. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Darren, for the lovely introduction. Thank you very much for being here. And let me sort of express my gratitude both to Harvard University, to Simmons College, and to Olympiacos, of course, for organizing this amazing event. I think I'm not the first one to mention this, but everyone has been overly generous, and I'm very much enjoying the trip thus far, and I hope to see some presentations and to engage in debate further on today. But without no further ado, since we have 20 minutes only, let me sort of get to the title of my talk and my talk in general. So when I saw the call for a conference paper, due to my research focus, I was rather interested in the aspect of reinforcement of boundaries and borders than in the aspect of transcendence. That also reflects sort of in my presentation that is largely based on my PhD research that deals more generally with the nexus of politics, sports, and ideology in the post-Yugoslav space, and more narrowly with sport and its significance for Croatian national identity ever since its independence in 1990-1991. So why Yugoslavia? Most people of you do still remember or have a quite vivid memory of the images that went around the world in the early 1990s when Yugoslavia fell apart into a bloody conflict, a conflict that basically lasted until the end of 1999 and had its pinnacle in the bombardment of what today is Serbia and Montenegro by NATO forces. But also, as in other parts of the world, sport is intrinsically interrelated with the formation of identity. But in the case of post-Yugoslav space, I would say that sport, and particularly football, have been a field that is central to the way that nationhood is understood, and hence also how the others beyond the border are perceived vis-a-vis against the identity being formed within the border. Without sort of wanting to bore you with concepts, but this idea of Pierre Bourdieu and national habitus codes very much relates to sport and football in particular when it comes to the countries that have emerged out of Yugoslavia. Historically, and you see one image here, the Maksimir riots in 1990, a game between Red Star Belgrade and Dinamo Zagreb that was never played, are widely perceived as the symbolic date on which the war started and Yugoslavia began to fall apart. Now this is, of course, a very mythologized narrative that is supposed to be deconstructed, but it's, so from an academic perspective, but from popular memory, it's very much widely established as a defining symbolic moment of recent Yugoslav history, or late socialist Yugoslav history. Furthermore, the involvement of organized football fans in the wars that were to come. Here you see an image of a battalion that was formed by Torcida, which is the organized fan group of Hajduk Split, but more widely acknowledged is the involvement of particularly fans from Red Star Belgrade and the fan group of the Delier, the Heroes, from whom paramilitary formations were drawn into the war in the early 1990s. The result of the wars themselves, and this is sort of reflected, I couldn't find a better picture, is that the region has a lot of athlete ambassadors who had a refugee experience. Now, this is an image of the fair refugee 11 from the Euros 2016. As you can see, quite a high number of players have come from former Yugoslavia. Luka Modric, Neven Subotic, Dejan Lovren, Granit Xhaka, Vedran Čoruka, Ibišević, so almost half of them. I mean, these are sort of the best players that they took into this top 11. There's, of course, numerous others. Sort of last but not least, Croatia, and more importantly, Serbia and Macedonia have been at the center of the so-called refugee crisis in 2015 and beyond, with a high number of refugees still being trapped in Belgrade, particularly Belgrade, after the closure of the Balkan route. Now, it's obvious that football and its interrelationship with recent history in the region is not just a field in which to examine inter-ethnic reconciliation, but also one of social inclusion of newly arrived migrants and refugees over the last 2 years. At the same time, let me say that I won't be focusing on that in particular, A, because there's people, and I'll mention them, who focus on that, who do much better work, and also because the number of migrants and refugees stuck is significantly lower than, for example, in Greece or Turkey or other places that we will mention. We're talking about roughly 10,000 people, one doesn't really know, in Belgrade. In other parts of former Yugoslavia, even less. So why the title, to come back? It's clearly a reference, or trying to be a reference to the socialist ideological credo proclaiming that workers have no fatherland. So the primary mode of identification for athletes and sportsmen is supposed to always act in the sense of internationalism, in promoting togetherness and mutual understanding. A similar credo that is also perpetuated by the International Olympic Committee. Now, there's, as I will show, an obvious discrepancy between this credo and the way that sport is perceived, not just in the countries that I'm talking about, but more generally, as a central aspect of ritually performing nationhood, both from athletes and from spectators alike. So when I approached the topic of today's talk and the conference in general, I had sort of numerous images that were emblematizing what I see when I'm thinking about sports and in the post-Yugoslav space and interethnic communication and relations. So what kind of interaction are we talking here? Is it a top-down from players? Is it a bottom-up from fans? Is it corporational, confrontative, or is it conflictual? So focusing less on the newly arrived migrants and refugees, I'd actually would like to point out a few arguments as to why we must take seriously the limitations that we face when we talk about using sport and football, sport in general, as a vehicle for social transformation and inclusion. As much as sort of it is important to underline all the good that sport can have in societies, I think it's certainly fruitful to also think about the flip side of it all. So what I will focus on is mostly the representative nature of sport in terms of national categories, something that I see as a primary obstacle in providing a one-way tool, so to say, for the creation of interethnic understanding, and particularly in the Balkans. So the images that I then chose to show you are the images that we all love, and the images that were widely shared on social media and media over the last years, maybe not in an international setting, but in the region itself. On the one, this is an image of two basketball players, Bogdan Bogdanovic and Bojan Bogdanovic, one playing for Serbia, one playing for Croatia from the Euro Championship of 2 years ago. So they're promoting an idea of closeness and common cultural heritage of the countries that are no longer together. Furthermore, pictures that went viral in the region of Novak Djokovic fraternizing with players of the Croatian handball team. Now, for those of you who don't know, handball is a huge sport in southeastern Europe, particularly in Croatia and in Serbia. So, again, something of important symbolics. Or the image of kids in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in Mostar here in particular, of different ethnicities, seemingly getting along really well during a tournament organized by Football Beyond Borders. But on the flip side, again, to talk about that, the images that still pertain and that are more widely distributed worldwide are those of conflict and not of cooperation. So images like the tearing down of the drone incident, the so-called drone incident during the game between Albania and Serbia only 2 years ago, if I'm not mistaken, that resulted in skirmishes and the game being abandoned. The games being a vehicle or a public space to express exclusionary nationalism. Here you have a Croatian war, a reference to the Croatian homeland war, and Vukovar as the symbol of Croatian suffering displayed during the 2013 game between Croatia and Serbia, clearly indicating difference and division rather than anything of a reconciliatory nature. And last but not least, violence, literal as well as symbolic, verbal as well as physical. Particularly present during games within domestic leagues, but more sort of problematic in countries like Macedonia and Bosnia, where they often take on conflicts that are fought out along ethnic lines. Now, sport research in the post-Yugoslav space, as you can see from the images that I showed, has been a fairly marginalized topic. There has been quite some focus on football hooliganism, on the question of violence, and particularly the 1990s and the way that organized football fans went into war. Now, my background itself is from nationalism studies, and I sort of try to understand sport and football, and more particularly, not merely as a reflection of society, but as an integral part of society, which may be used as a means of reflecting on society, to quote McClenty here. So for me, sport in general, and football due to sporting hierarchies in particular, is a social field of popular culture where the narrative of the nation as an imagined community is certainly most significantly perpetuated, amplified into social fields far beyond its own reach. And then I see that part of the last quote was cut off. So sport and the R word, the question of reconciliation. So it's an exploration whether sport can be a facilitator of ideological vehicles that could lead to an enhanced sense of togetherness and interethnic understanding. Now, as there are people here who will be talking with far more authority, I'll just skip sort of the entire scholarship on sports and development and peace, but as you can see, sort of very briefly outlined on this slide, and go straight to the question of the post-Yugoslav space. Now, Bosnia and Herzegovina are the archetypical, so to say, case study for academics who have dealt with interethnic relations. Davide Sterkele, Emily West, from an ethnographic point of view, and Herovic and Veo looking at the World Cup 2014, and this dominant narrative in the country that now that the national team has qualified, we finally have a unifying force that will transcend borders and boundaries within the different ethnic communities. Regional leagues, I'll talk about them in a bit, are also sort of as a social field where rather cooperation than conflict is established. The general conclusions of all of these academic articles and books are that there's a huge discrepancy between the social goals and the intentions and social reality. On the grassroots level, to come back, there's a myriad of examples of everyday sporting encounters on the youth and amateur level. There's an Open School Foundation, Football Beyond Borders, Football Friends, all internationally funded sporting NGOs who particularly work with kids and youth in order to get different ethnic communities playing together. On another level, there's a slow emergence of sport-related work with refugees, with international NGOs like World Vision or UEFA, the UEFA Foundation, actually bringing money into Serbia, Croatia, and Macedonia to help refugees. And Zagreb 041 is sort of the outstanding example in Croatia who do work with refugees and minorities, engage in anti-racist work. But to be fair and to all of you, it's a very, very marginal phenomenon. We're talking about a group that is consisting of very few, yet very, very dedicated people. I mean, something to be supported, but also to be put in context. And sort of to be put in a sort of slightly bigger context, as you see, this is a database of Football Against Racism in Europe, who provides information about all sporting clubs and NGOs dealing with football and refugees in the region, and Croatia, so in the entire region, Zagreb 041 being the only initiative there. So to brush through this, the top-down level, there has been a post-2000 political normalization within the sporting fields that was mainly mirrored in the creation of regional leagues in water polo, basketball, and handball, where violence among football fans has been ever decreasing. The most important sport in the region, football, however, has not yet managed to even remotely find a way or a solution towards forming a regional league, which would be an economic necessity for the countries of former Yugoslavia. Athlete fraternization and the uniting refugee experience is something that particularly athletes can build on to work and to function as ambassadors and to actually use their important and sort of heightened role in the societies in order to provide sort of guidance and also to provide inspiration. On the representational level, and this is sort of where I come to the crux of it all, is the question of national identity, and I'll be sort of done in a minute. The idea that we still have the representative team in the region itself as the most dominant way of portraying and perpetuating an idea of the nation as an ethnic community that is not open towards migrants, towards refugees, towards particularly political minorities themselves. Eric Hobsbawm, just to quote sort of an outstanding historian here, that has to do with the fact that the imagined community of millions seems so much more real as a team of 11 named players, transforming the individual into a symbol of the nation himself. So I'm going to skip sort of these performative elements of national and representative sport as I'm nearing to the end of the presentation. But in conclusion, I'd like to sort of just quote Alan Berner, who argues that sport continues to play a greater role in maintenance of distinctive national identities rather than in the construction of some uniform global identity. So what I actually just wanted to sort of give foods for thought is about the schizophrenic malleability of sport and its nature, that it's not only there for good, but it's also there for the bad. So on to end on a sort of more positive note, what does that mean for sport institution, clubs, players and fans? I think initiatives like this one and the ones that I mentioned are very important, don't get me wrong. It's just something that we need to sort of put in context when thinking about all the good that they do. Thank you very much.
Great. We're going to invite Mike to the stage now.
Kalamara. I don't think our tour guide is here this morning, but thanks to our tour guide, Kelly, for teaching me that introduction yesterday morning. I am Mike Hops. My presentation for many refugees, soccer is a path to assimilation. I won't dwell on myself here. Darren has already introduced me, but I am from the United States, an unusual place that managed to give the world both Barack Obama and Donald Trump. I'm still on Washington time, so this is the first time that I've presented at 3 o'clock in the morning. I really wanted to hide the page notes. Let me see if I can figure out how to do that.
F5.
F5. My goodness.
No, it's going. Yeah.
Here we are. Okay, thank you. All right. Football. Football, kuju, nogomet, calcio, sepak bola, soccer, the world's game, the beautiful game, whatever you call it, the sport has the power to bring joy to the billions who watch it and the hundreds of millions who play it. Because it is the world's most popular sport, it has the power to transcend linguistic differences and to knock down barriers. It also has the power to heal deep psychological wounds, and there may be no arena where this is truer than a refugee camp. I like to imagine that if humankind ever were to make contact with intelligent life beyond our galaxy, it may be that the second thing that we find in common with that alien intelligence, perhaps after recognition of prime numbers, is a proclivity to kick a ball around. Soccer is the world's most popular game because it is the most primal. Once children become ambulatory, their next instincts are to run, to kick, and to chase. You can see the three boys pictured here are wearing identical number 10 Ronaldinho jerseys from FC Barcelona. The image was taken in 2007 when Ronaldinho played for Barca. There are 7.5 billion people in the world, and 22.5 million of them are refugees. If you count the number of internally displaced persons, that is, refugees who've had to flee their hometown but not cross a border, the number of refugees grows to 65.3 million, or 9 in every 1,000 people the world over. Many of us from industrialized countries don't know any refugees, and that's largely because we hide them away, but they're there. To put the number in perspective, there's a good chance you know someone who's schizophrenic. If not someone in your family, perhaps someone who lives a few doors down from you. The number of persons the world over living with schizophrenia is only a little higher than the number of refugees and internally displaced persons. If the number of refugees and internally displaced persons were a country, it would be almost exactly as populous as the United Kingdom. This is the second highest number of refugees the world has had to handle at once since the Second World War. Refugees suffer high rates of post-traumatic stress, of prolonged mourning, of psychosomatic problems, chronic stress, eating disorders, feelings of injustice, helplessness, isolation, and loneliness. Especially traumatic for refugees is the loss of a loved one, killed or murdered in conflict. And worse still is the loss of someone disappeared. In many cultures, the living have an ongoing relationship with the dead. For survivors, this essential relationship cannot be realized fully until the lost relative is known to be dead and the remains are put to proper rest. Many of you are familiar with Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of human needs. Neither governmental agencies nor most governmental organizations regard sport and social provision as a priority for refugees and asylum seekers. Aid organizations are concerned with providing refugees with the most basic human needs: food, shelter, safety. After all, it is highly unlikely that one can achieve the top layer of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, achieving one's full potential, without meeting first the lower ones. But it is the middle layer of Maslow's hierarchy, belonging and love, friends and intimate relationships, that sport and teamwork can provide. Sport and teamwork can and often do equip refugees with therapeutic value in overcoming trauma and promoting social inclusion. Now, this is why I say soccer is our most primal game. In a refugee camp, a soccer match will simply materialize. The game is more popular than chocolate. Refugees will make a ball from anything, from bags or paper towels. A long-sleeve t-shirt is ideal, for the sleeves can be tied in a knot around the crumpled-up shirt. I'm going to give you a few case studies. There are more in the paper that I was asked to write for the conference. Catherine Palmer conducted qualitative interviews with a group of young Muslim refugee women in Adelaide, South Australia, who played on a soccer team. And she found that their experience of playing soccer together helped establish and promote their cultural identity. This is a common theme in the literature. Denab, Thiebaum, Van Engelen, and colleagues studied young immigrant girls living in Belgium in 1992 and 93. They found that despite low participation rates in soccer among these girls, they showed a distinct interest in the sport. Maggie Fern and Justine Howard in 2012, they examined interventions with children who had survived bombing in Lebanon, children who were wards of the state in Romania, and street children in Brazil and Colombia. All the children faced adversity, usually rising to the level of trauma. The authors found that the subjects interacted with and influenced their environment through play in ways that helped them work through their trauma. In Italy, authorities have set up shelters throughout the country where asylum seekers can wait to get their applications processed and resolved. The wait can be months, and there isn't much to do but play soccer. Liberi Nantes, a Latin phrase meaning roughly free sailor or free sailing, is a Rome-based NGO that tries to give refugees, immigrants, and asylees something positive to do. It's organized a team that plays in Italy's lowest amateur league. The aim is not simply to pass time, but to form new relationships. Says Alberto Urbanati, a co-founder of the team, it's important to let them play with Italian guys. Every match is an occasion to meet and have an exchange with Italian guys. Established in 2007, Liberi Nantes has a new team each year. Now, Urbanati goes on, he talks about reactions from Italian footballers to his immigration teams. He says, usually we have either indifference or a very good welcome, because sport is very powerful in this way. You don't have to explain who you are, where you come from. You just put the ball in play in the middle of the field and you start to play. What we see in the great majority of case studies is assimilation taking place. For most refugees, assimilation to a culture comes in two phases. One must adapt first to one's point of entry, often a refugee camp. Second, one must adapt to the new homeland and strive towards citizenship. Now, Julian Ford in the United States at the University of Connecticut School of Medicine defines psychological trauma as a threat to one's survival or to the survival of something a person loves, trusts, and looks to for support, such as one's parent. He offers an exercise his field uses to help victims of psychological trauma, which consists of focusing the mind on one thought, on what you value and who you are as a person. He says that this recalibrates the brain. From Ford's finding on those with whom he works, he describes a remarkable byproduct. Trauma survivors don't simply want to survive, they want to make a contribution to society. Refugees, asylees, and other immigrants suffer higher rates of post-traumatic stress, depression, and other mental health concerns than their non-immigrant peers. Refugees and asylees generally experience stress in their transition to a new country, causing various degrees of mental health symptoms and trauma. Children are particularly vulnerable. They face varying degrees of discrimination, social isolation, post-traumatic stress, poverty, and adaptive challenges in their new schools and neighborhoods. Compounding this difficulty is that refugees and other immigrants are far less likely than non-immigrants with comparable mental health symptoms to access mental health services. Now, this may seem obvious or not obvious, but there are several reasons for this. There is stigma in many cultures for accessing mental health services. Refugees, people to a new land often aren't aware that services exist. And in some places, the United States is one, those services can be very expensive. Luma Mefla and the Clarkson, Georgia Fugees. Now, if you have a pen with you, I'd like you to write down Luma Mefla's name. She is a remarkable person, and you should check out her TED Talk. The Fugees are a soccer team made up entirely of refugee children in Clarkston, Georgia, near Atlanta in the United States, coached by Luma Mefla, herself the daughter of a Syrian refugee. Mefla founded the team in 2004 after making a wrong turn while driving through Clarkston and noticing a group of boys playing soccer in the street. She learned they were refugees from war-torn lands, Afghanistan, Bosnia, Iraq, Myanmar, Somalia, Sudan, Syria. As a girl growing up in Jordan, Mefla had hated one of her coaches, but later she remembered that she wanted to play better for him than for any other coach. She respected the tight ship he had run and emulated that style when she became a coach herself. Luma dismissed Christian, a young Liberian forward, from the Fugees for swearing at practice. She had warned him once. After the second time, she told him to leave and not come back. Christian then lost 3 siblings and a young cousin in a fire in his family's apartment in Clarkston. Christian survived the fire by jumping out a window. After losing his siblings and cousins, Christian began showing up to Fugees practices and watching silently behind a chain-link fence. Luma gave second chances, but seldom a third. One day she finally motioned for Christian to come over and told him he could rejoin the team provided he never swore again. No exceptions. Christian agreed. Now, I could tell you that in his first game back with the team, that the Fugees won 9-2 and Christian scored 5 goals. And it would be true, but it's sort of beside the point. Luma, and again, I urge you to Google her and watch her TED Talk, is just a remarkable person. Some people, most of us, I think, really don't find her calling in life. Luma is a person who found her calling in life. I mentioned that she's a Syrian refugee. She grew up in Jordan. She's Muslim. She's gay. It's illegal. Homosexuality is illegal in Jordan. She won a lottery to come to the United States. And when she was driving around in Clarkston and had made a wrong turn, and she did not know what she was going to do with her life. She founded the Fugees. This was 2004. The story I told you about Christian was in 2007. And since then, she still coaches, and she's created an academy for refugees. Refugees often are behind other people. They're people the same age in school. And so she teaches refugees specifically, well, I mean, they're together so they can catch up in school and whatnot. Dawit, a 14-year-old Fugee from Eritrea, says, "The Fugees are like my brothers and sisters because they play with me, they help me, they laugh with me, and they hang out with me. They're also like my family because when I got worries, I can always talk to them about it, and they will make me feel better." When people who have fled war-torn countries reach a new land only to find home at first in a tent city, overcoming trauma and forging meaning are tall orders. Place them in close quarters among other refugees of different ethnicities who speak different dialects or languages, and you have a recipe for hostility and even violence. Or more likely yet, an awesome pickup game, because the universal language of soccer has a way of making those differences dissolve. Now, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration in the United States, with its contractor DSG, that's the company that I'm with, maintains a database called the National Registry of Evidence-Based Programs and Practices, NREP. This online searchable database details more than 330 interventions for the prevention and treatment of mental and substance use disorders. NREP helps people, agencies, and organizations identify, customize, and carry out evidence-based programs and practices in their communities. 8 of these programs listed here have been evaluated as producing positive outcomes in addressing trauma and stress-related disorders and symptoms. The boy in the picture here arrived in Greece by way of Turkey on a boat trip arranged by smugglers. The image was captured at the beach just outside the Suda refugee camp on the Greek island of Chios. Now, there is a fair amount of literature on soccer and other sport as a means of combating social exclusion and promoting social inclusion. And there is a great deal of literature on the needs of refugees and asylees. What there still is little of is serious research on how sport specifically helps refugees assimilate to a new environment. But the anecdotal evidence is ubiquitous and powerful. Thank you very much for your time and for your attention.
Okay, welcome. Thank you for the kind introduction. My name is Gijs Betonk. I'm teaching and researching migration, citizenship and identity for quite a long time. But I included sport since only 2 years, so therefore I'm very grateful to Simmons and Harvard University and Olympiacos to organize this event and to give me the opportunity to present our research, which just really started 2 years back with now 3 PhDs, and we are hiring more on a new project which in non-academic words could be summarized in the question who may represent the nation, or who belongs to the country, or who is a citizen, or what is a citizen, in all kind of variations. So what we see in this picture, it's a photoshopped picture of Diego Costa in a Brazilian shirt on the right in yellow, and in a Spanish shirt on the left in red. Diego Costa played 2 friendly matches for Brazil. He was born in Brazil. He is a Brazilian, though now he has Spanish citizenship as well. And after these 2 matches, just prior to the World Cup in 2014, he decided that he wished to play for Spain. This raised an enormous debate on shifting identities, shifting national identities. What would this mean for the team? Why is he doing this? Etc., etc. Following the news, the Brazilian coach Scolari commented a Brazilian player who refuses to wear the shirt of the Brazilian national team and compete in a World Cup in your country, the World Cup was in Brazil, is automatically withdrawn. He is turning his back on the dreams of millions to represent our national team, the 5-time world champions in Brazil. So to understand what is happening here and whether this is an exceptional case or not, we have to withdraw, step back a little bit and think about how do football players, or in general, how do people like you and me actually acquire citizenship? So again, I'm not going to summarize a very long debate, but everyone, I think, in this room is aware that 3 principles are in general important here. First is citizenship acquired through descent. So if your father is a German and your mother is a German, most of us, would understand that the children are Germans. So this is a very strong idea of belonging. It's related to family. The second issue is, or the second example is citizenship by birth, like in the US. If you are born in the US or you are born in Canada, you are an American citizen. And then, since, say, about 15 or 20 years, especially in Europe, we have a third principle, which is in the literature called the Stakeholder Principle. This is about, migrants mostly coming from Morocco and Turkey, but it could be, any migrants who've been working for 5 years, or in other countries 7 years, or again in other countries 9 years or longer. They are able to acquire local, say, Dutch or German citizenship. So these are the 3 types of acquiring citizenship. That does apply to you and me, but it also applies to soccer players. And as I will argue in this day, is this might change the idea we think about the nation state, and also how we would deal in the future with the World Cup and the selection of the World Cup. And I'd like to debate that in a few minutes with you. So Diego Costa realized that maybe it was not such a good idea to make this transformation, because he says, above, I get criticized a lot, also in Spain, because I'm not native Spanish enough. Even the Spanish audience is not very happy with me. He was very much booed upon during the World Cup, and Business Insider called him the most hated man in the World Cup. So, it's really passionate. It's really, people are very passionate about these kind of issues. So again, let's go to how does this acquiring of citizenship work in practice. On the left is Dirk Kuyt. He's one of my heroes. That's why I'm putting him there. So you might not know him, but in Holland he's very, very famous. After 18 years, last year we won the Dutch championship with him. He scored the 3 goals in the last game. The other reason is that he's born in the Netherlands. His father and his mother is born in the Netherlands. He has played soccer first for Utrecht and then for Feyenoord before he left for Liverpool and then for for Fenerbahce and then came back to Feyenoord. No one ever debated his background as a Dutch citizen. There was no issue about it. Most of us, 99%, we don't even think about these issues. But the argument is that it's actually, in any other case, it's shifting some balancing lines. Next is Julian Gray. He was born in Germany with a German mother and an American father. So, therefore, he had dual citizenship. German and American. despite the fact that he never visited, and he was a talented football player, he plays for Bayern Munich, but he was not good enough to play for the German national team. And then the German coach invited him, the German coach Klinsmann, but he was the coach for the American national team, invited him to play for the American national team. Despite the fact when he played his first thing, he never visited the US. He did not speak English very well, a little. So here we have someone with dual, two options. Not really dual nationality, but two or more options. So in our research, what you see in the 2014 World Cup, about 1/3 of the 736 players that are selected, and they are represented in all kinds of national teams, 1/3, more than 30%, had more options. So that's quite a significant number. We don't know that, but if you are going into the lines, it's quite interesting. And the argument is that trainers as well as players in the future will increase their options, use them for either personal or national gains. Julian Gray is one of them. Next is other Dutch, I'm not sure whether he's Dutch, but a Dutch player, which is Jonathan Guzman. Jonathan de Guzman was selected at the age of 12, and he came to Feyenoord. But he was born in Canada. His father is from the Philippines. His mother is from Jamaica. And since the age of 12, he lived in the Netherlands, and he acquired Dutch citizenship at the age of 18. So formally, according to current FIFA rules, he was eligible to play either for the Philippines, for Jamaica, for Canada, or for the Netherlands. So he had a lot of options, but he was very good. He was good enough to play for the Netherlands, for the Dutch team. So he said, no, I'm not going for the Canadian team, or I want, maybe if I choose for the Dutch team, I become the next world champion. I'm sorry, we didn't make it, even with him. It is interesting because his choice was never debated. In the Netherlands, we all accepted, it's okay, he's 5 years in the Netherlands, 6 years in the Netherlands, he's playing for Feyenoord. Actually, he left Feyenoord quite soon after that, and he never visited the Netherlands again. But he's still playing for the Dutch national team. His brother is playing for the Canadian team, actually. So this is interesting. You have two brothers playing for different national teams. So one of our PhD students, Gijs van Kampenhout, looked at all the World Cups since 1930 up to 2014, and he was just counting the number of foreign-born players. And what you see in general that's important is that in the 1930s, it's about 6 or 7%. These were people like, Italian migrants who went to Argentina and then came there, and they got children, and then they played for Italy, or the other way around. So these are these kind of cases. But what you see since 98 or 2002, the number is increasing. So what is important also to mention is that the only country that never selected a foreign-born player to represent them is Brazil. All other countries in one or two things have selected other players as well. So for Brazil, it's quite clear because they have the richest talented pool, you could say. I mean, they are really exporting players. They play everywhere. But in other cases, like Equatorial Guinea, or for example, Qatar is, organizing the next World Cup. They have only 300,000 people, not so much talent. How many of the local Qataris do really play soccer? So they are trying to find other ways to attract talented players. And for example, under these 5-year rules, they have set up a kind of project to hire talented African players have them for 5 years, either in Africa or in Qatar, and then hopefully the best of those, a few thousand, will play for Qatar in 2022. This is the Equatorial Guinea team, and they played with 9 Brazilians in the selection during 2011 and 2015. At one time they played with 9 Brazilians. They had a Brazilian coach. I have to be frank, we do not really know what they do with the official rules. I mean, there might be some illegal activities involved there, but this at least raises again the question who actually belongs to the nation or who is allowed to represent the nation. Because after all, the national team, it's the flag, it's the national hymn, it's the national crowd. But what will really happen if we are represented by, well, non-nationals, people who we not feel familiar with for one reason or the other? So I'll slowly come back to the major question which I'd like to introduce to you. What I see in the near future is that coaches will increasingly look for talent in the football center, which is, you know, Germany, the UK, etc., and look for people with dual citizenship, like, for example, Julian Gray. Julian Gray was not an exception. I remember 1/3 of the total amount. The photo left is the photo of the American national soccer team without the people who are born in the US itself. Jürgen Klinsmann hired 5 people like Julian Gray, which is interesting. The second one is even, I think, more pressing, because what happens? We do have in Europe top 5 competitions. The UK, France, Italy, Germany, and Spain. They attract very young talent, like the Guzman in the Netherlands. They come at the age of 12, 14, 16, whatever. When they are 22 or 25 or 26, they are eligible to play for the national team of Spain or the UK or France or anything. So they have a choice, they have an option, but also the national coach has an option either to hire these kind of talented player. And then we have the extreme, there's one thing to add. So this really, so for the top 5 countries in Europe, their talented pool will increase much more than the Dutch, the Danish, the whatever, Croatian background. So this will change the face, I would say, for international football. And maybe national clubs will act like local clubs, hire players. We can debate these things. The last example is countries in Asia and the Middle East. You know, they increasingly accept Brazilians and African players in their local competitions, but in the near future you will see them also in the national teams, because they want and they wish to enhance their chances in international football as well. So I come to the major question. So in the future it will be increasingly common that 2 national teams play against each other with players that are not born and raised in that country, like the American example. So my question is then, is this just a reflection of globalization and increasing interconnection and migration patterns? Will national players contract players just like regular footballers do, etc., etc.? So should this be allowed, or should we try to prevent it with all kind of regulations? Now, I'm very much aware that most of us have a very strong opinion of that, but before you raise your opinion, I'd like you to step back, because we have to think about the consequences at various levels. One is the perspective for receiving states. So for receiving stage, it's increasingly important to have these talented players, because it increases their chances to be a part of a game which now is not, they are not able to win or even to have any chance to win. So they hire talent and also wish, therefore, to increase the level of the local players. But the standing stage, in many cases, might not be too happy with it for obvious reasons, but also because they say, we invested in this talent, they come from this place. We have set up all kind of youth programs to find these talents, and now when they are 14 or 15, actually in the Netherlands we face that, and then they are sent to the UK or to Spain or whatever, and they get the credits. So we have the perspective of, we have also the perspective of individuals and human rights. We discussed that yesterday. So why should people be prevented to play wherever they wish to play? We have accepted that now, if it comes to normal competitions, and maybe we are going to accept it when it comes to international competitions. There is a debate coming. And then obviously the transnational, we wish to enforce fair play, so FIFA, the EUC, a part of our research. I mean, I'm talking about soccer now, but this is also maybe even stronger in the Olympic Games. So, to come back to this question, and I'd like you to think about it. So, what do you think? Is it just a reflection of globalization and growing interconnection? Or should we try in what way to prevent that, our national teams is represented by maybe non-nationals, let me put it this way. So how many of you, and I'd like you to raise your hand, how many of you think that we should prevent this in one way or the other? I mean, raise your hands. No one? Or is everyone on it? I see a few, 1, 2, this is a very small minority. Can you, yeah, in the back, there is someone in the back. Just stand up, I will repeat, Joe. What would be your major argument? Oh yeah, that's even better, there is a mic coming.
The game, international game, is going to become another industrialized area if national teams managers start choosing different players from different countries. So that's one of the main reasons. I think money will involve when they being picked up for another nation. Obviously, there will be like some fees to be paid. All of a sudden, international games become another area for industrialized football to abuse or to use it in different way. I think if someone chooses to be 3 arguments you put out there. If they become a national of a country, so they can choose whichever one to play, that's their choice. But if they can be picked by a manager of another country, I think that's why it should be prevented.
Yeah, yeah, okay. There was one more who was there on the same line who wished to prevent non-nationals playing for the national team. Oh, here. Press.
Okay. Well, not none, but with some qualification. The example of someone has dual citizenship. Julian Gray, I think he is not. I don't know that he has lived in the United States. I'm not sure, but he has an American parent. That seems reasonable.
Yeah.
And but I don't know the details of the Equatorial Guinea team, but it's 9 out of 11 players from Brazil. I don't know if those players ever lived in Ecuador. It seems rather extreme.
Yeah.
And so it seems with some restriction. It would be nice.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that if you had players that were entirely from other countries playing under one flag in the World Cup, it would be sort of false advertising. So it's false advertising. It's like, I mean, we take for granted that in professional teams and club teams you can have players from all over, and that's fine, and everybody knows that. But in the World Cup, we named the teams for the countries. And
yeah. So I think a good argument, and we will press the others also for their argument, but a good argument, you could say that, the US being a country of migrants, also they send, their military outside, they marry locally, so why not include those in your, it's part of the image of the US, isn't it? So why not, is this a representation of the country? But I think it's getting, for many people, it's getting, feeling a bit uncomfortable when, for example, Qatar is, organizing, institutionalizing and hiring, I think it was about 1,600 or 1,800 talented Africans, mostly from West Africa, more than 3 or 4 years back, and then hoping to include them in this so-called 5 years rule from the FIFA, and that they would be eligible to play for Qatar. I'm sure in the Netherlands, people will not, be in favor of that and will not, applaud for that kind of national team. But I went to Qatar, you went, they will. I know there is a debate on it now, but if they are winning the first match in the World Cup, they will go crazy. So, okay, I'd like to, 1 or 2 more on the other side. Who really thinks, okay, this is just going to happen, it's a reflection of globalization, migration, there's not much we can do? Yeah.
I'd like to add something. Is this thing on? Yeah. I think this is very much focused on the nation state and is completely ignoring colonialism, because a white Englishman born in Hong Kong, like Terry Butcher, gets bloodied shirt and is seen as the epitome of Englishness, and yet someone from a former colony, maybe with black skin, would not be seen in the same way. So a lot of this is coming down through historical sort of power indifferences, and I think that needs to be taken into account when we sort of look at some of these stories.
I fully agree, we do. I didn't do it in this presentation, but we fully, no, of course. So there are patterns of migration, and actually the graph you saw, if you go into detail, you can follow these patterns, because colonialism is a big deal in that. But that, again, it's expanding beyond that.
Absolutely.
Okay, 1 more, and then we finish up and we go to the other speakers, please.
Hi, thank you. I'd just like to echo Mark's point that I think power dynamics are a really important part of this, and it's tough to talk about this sensitively, often in a climate where often outside of football, a lot of debate is talking about pulling up a drawbridge and Frontex and borders going up, and I think it's important to use the right to approach this and not be blind to dynamics of like race and power and how they're feeding into discussions and positionality of those teams. And a lot of I don't know, like people from Western European countries talking about notions of statehood, to people from, which are obviously historically situated, and it's quite hard to generalize across 200 nations and things. So I don't know, just would point that out as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for your comment.
Thank you very much. So I'm just going to make a few comments about each of the papers. I'll probably make a few comments and then maybe a question that sort of came out of my thoughts about each paper that maybe if you guys want to respond to, that's fine, and then open it up to the audience for any other questions that you have. In our first presentation by Dario, a lot of themes came out to me in your presentation. One, this notion of sport, and I think this is a big, I think there's a lot of big principles that are going to drive the rest of the way we think about all of the presentations in this work, is sport as a constructor or reclaimer of identity, I think was a powerful theme in your presentation. That's something that we have to chew on and think about moving forward in all the presentations. But I also appreciated the notion of the dynamic nature of these situations in terms of what identity means, especially thinking about the collapse of the Yugoslavia and how that recreates identity along ethnic lines, and then ironically the ways in which refugees are pouring into newly formed ethnic or national identities, and then how that even shifts what we mean by identity, right? So what does it mean to be a Syrian refugee in Bosnia, for example, right? And how that even further shifts what identity means. And then and I was really struck, and I know you quoted this, I was really struck by this as another, I think, really important principle moving forward, is sports as a reflection of and a reflection on society, right? And so we're really trying to and this notion of whether it's one, the other, or if it's like a feedback loop is a really important thing for us to chew on moving forward. In other words, is sport just showing us what the world is, or to what extent is sport then changing the conditions for better or for worse moving forward? And I guess the question that I had is towards the end, that I saw a lot of your potential solutions, and one of the things that I'd love for all of us to think about, and in particular, is thinking about, as we think about the ways in which we want clubs to support refugees and other issues like that, the question that it raises for me is, what will the athletes, and therefore the societies gain by authentic work with refugees, right? So thinking about, you bring up the notion that when we see clubs and we see our favorite athletes working with refugees, that has a powerful effect. And I think we need to think hard about what athletes in particular would gain by doing authentic work with refugees, and then what impact that would have on society at large. And this is especially true given I love this slide, especially given that some of these, especially top shelf players, are refugees themselves, right? And the impact that can have on the conversation. So that's what I'd love for you to think about. In Mike Hopp's presentation, really struck by the notion of sports as a healing process, right? And so you really highlight the notions of the healing that is necessary for many refugees because of the traumas that they've experienced in the process. And I was also struck by, thank you, I love pockets of hope. I love, there's a lot of negativity to think about, a lot of challenges to think about, but I love thinking about the pockets of hope. And your story about a queer Syrian refugee woman in the United States, okay? I'm gonna say that again, a queer refugee woman in the United States. All those identities are under attack, right? They have been, they are currently under attack, right?
And don't forget Muslim.
Right, yeah. right. Working with other refugees to come together in suburban Georgia, and Georgia, United States, and if you know the history of suburban Georgia, that's not necessarily, it's not a place where it's got a history, a sordid history. So there's something powerful about reflecting on that story. And I always like finding I always talk about the beautiful struggle. So this notion of finding beauty in the struggle, I think, is something powerful to hold on to, and that we need to reflect on more. And I also heard and I think it's we need even more empirical research on what impact sports actually has on refugees' abilities to cope and integrate. My question that came out of my thinking about your presentation was whether, as we think about sports as healing folks, especially when we think about refugees, was sport a builder of resilience, right? Is it a builder of resilience for refugees? Or is it really a reflection of their resilience, right? And so for me, when I think of refugees, I think of people, yes, who have a lot of challenges to overcome, but folks who are very strong and very resilient. And so I'm wondering the ways in which when we see sports and come together, to what extent sports is building resilience, or to what extent it's actually reflecting their resilience, or again, this feedback loop, if that makes sense. In Hyber's presentation, well, so first of all, as an Arsenal fan, Nothing gets my blood boiling like a picture of Diego Costa. But even you managed to get me to paint a sympathetic figure of Diego Costa. So now you've changed me. So thank you for doing that. Definitely struck by the notion of 1/3 of the World Cup 2014 players, having the potential to identify with multiple national identities. And really struck by this notion, I think, of the just nexi principle, right? Of thinking about the different ways in which we afford people nationality and citizenship. And we saw this through the brothers, playing for different national teams, the Guzmans, I think it was the Chaka brothers, one playing for Switzerland, one playing for Albania. But it raised some really important questions, I think, that you helped us think about, which is, one is like, how equitably is this principle actually applied, right? Is it based on a set of principles that's universal and humanistic, or to what extent is it transactional, right? And what is it? And what is the? And it also begs the question that you helped us think about this: who should be the arbiter of authentic national identity, right? And what are the implications that sport, that the organization, the enterprise of sport would be the vehicle for that to happen? And I think it's a really interesting question. So those are my remarks. I don't know if I just give you a chance, any of you a chance to respond to any of my questions, and then we can open it up to the audience for questions from y'all.
Well, if I may, just very briefly, I mean, I can only echo what you've said, that athletes and former professionals and professionals, not just footballers, but beyond football, do have a very important role, a potentially very important role as ambassadors for a variety of social issues. Unfortunately, people like Christian or Lilian are the exception to the rule, and there's a very widespread level of conformity among professional footballers, which is understood because politics is not supposed to be in sport, and though they keep most of their ideas and their thoughts to themselves. At times this is a good thing, at times that's a very bad thing. In the Southeast European or the post-Yugoslav context, they do have this refugee experience, and that could be used for good, but unfortunately their refugee experience has widely been nationalized for national victimhood narratives. So they function sort of as arbiters of their own already established national identity, rather than sort of trying to transcend these boundaries and sort of to form a more universal and more tolerant sort of idea built on their refugee experience.
Would you briefly repeat the question?
Yeah. The notion of whether sports, especially we think of sports as a healing process for refugees, and we assume that it's working. To what extent is sports building their resilience, or a reflection of their resilience? So is sports like making them stronger, or are they like strong and sports are helping us see that?
It's a bit of a chicken and egg question. Well, as an aside, the answer to which was created first, the chicken or the egg, the answer is the egg. But aside from that, I think that really sports builds the resilience. Yeah, the short answer. I think it does both, but I think it builds resilience.
Okay. Thank you.
I'll keep it brief. So according to me, the major thing is that we debate the issues I raised in individual cases, like Da Costa and whatever. And I think we should think as a community, as a local, national and international community, to debate this issue more fundamental and more structural. So that's why we are building these databases. So one is on the World Cups, one is on EUC memberships and athletes and changing citizenship issues. And then we should debate it with the stakeholders that I mentioned, the states, the individuals, the clubs, the FIFA, because I think one way or the other in the near 10 or 15 years, this will be an important debate. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, so we're going to now open it up to questions from the audience. I see one in the front row.
Thank you very much for your thoughts today. I'm wondering if you could speak to, and maybe not all of you, but speak to how folks have more than one identity. And so when you're talking about identity in this way, there may be other reasons as to why one might be seeking out somewhere else. It might feel safer personally. It might feel, and so I want to get to push a little bit on this. Who's the arbiter of who gets to decide your identity? You know, citizenship is just one form of identity. So if you could maybe speak to the idea of autonomy and identity politics and how this reflects to each one of your discussions, because I think it's easy to allow an organization to make decisions for citizens, but as we know that individuals are more than their citizenship, and that too can evolve based on just the day.
I'd like to answer that. You know, identity is shifting, of course, and often we identify with we choose the identity, or we embrace the identity that is placed upon us. In the United States, of course, we had a president, Barack Obama, who I think most of the world knows had a black father and a white mother. But at least in the United States, and probably the world over, he's thought of as black. And why is that? Well, often we embrace the identity which comes under attack. And he often was attacked as a black man. Growing up, he was raised by white grandparents, but he was seen as black. And he talks in his autobiography about going to Africa for the first time and having this lovely experience of just being able to disappear into the culture for the first time. You know, being able to just disappear and just feel as though the eyes weren't on him because of his color. You know, he eventually he was from Hawaii, but he identified with, he moved to Chicago, and the south side of Chicago, and he married a black woman, and that's the identity that he embraced. But identity is shifting, and we often choose the identity that the world chooses for us.
Again, but there's a lack of autonomy with that. He chose that for a reason himself.
Yeah.
Because he was able to articulate why that was important at the time. So, I mean, I think you're right. I just would like to hear more about athletes' personal ability to gain their own identity when so much is being placed on that.
If I just may sort of very, very briefly. So out of my experience and the interviews that I had and also read, it's mostly a question of actually strategic or strategic and or pragmatic citizenship, choosing particularly with the history of displacement and refugeedom in southeastern Europe, that the picture that you showed of the national team of Croatia, Serbia, or Bosnia would look exactly the same if not if they would only take players born in Croatia, Serbia, and Bosnia. But also, on the other hand, these countries have sort of a dominant understanding of what national identity is, and the dominant narrative is one of a trans-ethnic, transnational community. So even people who who haven't been born in Croatia or haven't been born in Serbia, like Neven Subotic, are then openly embraced into this sort of constructed national symboly as part of the national body, where sort of fractures and cleavages erupt is when they are utterly unable to connect to a certain local cultural context. In the Croatian case, it was just one player some 10 years back, and I even forget his name. He had a Croatian grandfather, but he was French, and he was very, very French, and he had never been to Croatia before. And then there was this entire debate in Croatia, like, well, why should we take him in? Just because he has a Croatian grandfather, but he doesn't speak the language, and doesn't know and so on and so forth. But generally, I think it's more of a strategic decision in order for players to, with a lot of agency from the players themselves, in order to increase their market value, in order to increase visibility, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, so I fully agree that, you know, the perspective of the individual players as a actor and hybrid and multi-role, it's very important. So it's not so much there in our research. But from the institutional perspective, it's very interesting to see that FIFA has a rule that once you, I mean, I showed Da Costa, so he played his 2 friendly matches, which do not really count. But then the first official match, he decided to play for Spain. After that, he cannot switch any alliance anymore. That's a FIFA rule. But for example, the International Olympic Committee say, we are not going into the question of citizenship because it's not our job to do that. So if a country says, you know, you are Spanish or German or American, you can, you know, represent that country. The only thing they have is there is a 3 years waiting period. So you cannot change your citizenship according to EOC rules every 3 or 4 years. But you can do it 3 or 4 times. And actually in our research, we have examples of people who did. Yeah.
So this is strategic. Exactly what's done.
Yeah. So the strategic is also on the institutional side, not to get involved, and obviously the individual side. Yeah.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Yes, thank you for your presentations. I just wanted to follow up with you, Mike. My name's Tamris Lane. I'm from the United States. I'm also indigenous to the United States. And I'd really like to challenge your... I agree with you on the fact that football is healing, but I don't think that assimilation and healing are one and the same, particularly for Native American people. And I think there's this concept in the United States, particularly, that assimilation is a good thing. And I'd like to challenge that the work that I've done is that really the football field or the soccer field is a space to reflect identity from whichever culture you come from because of its universal language. So I really like to think about an intergenerational trauma at that, and really how just the coming together, whether you're with your people of your same nation or of your same heritage, or with your cross-cultural interactions, is a space to really reflect your identity as opposed to assimilating to one particular culture. So I really like to just think about that word in a different way. Are you assuming that assimilation is a good thing? Because for Native people, it hasn't been.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, and in the United States, 99% of the population, if they did not immigrate to the United States, their ancestors did. And assimilation coming from other countries is largely a good thing and a helpful thing. But for the indigenous people, assimilation has been very destructive in many places, in many areas, as you know. And there is so much historical trauma that the indigenous people of the United States have dealt with, and you know much better than I that many indigenous people in the United States were, forced to abandon their culture. They were put in schools where they had to assimilate. They were asked not to speak in their native language. And practice Christianity and not their own religion or their own traditions, and that this was incredibly destructive. So you're right. Assimilation can be a positive thing or a negative thing. Yeah.
I see. I'm noticing the time, so I want to get, I think, one more question from over here. And then I want to give us a chance to transition to our time at 11:30, right? Yeah. So I see a question, right?
Yeah, I'm gonna ask one.
Okay. I was trying to get to.
Okay. I'm onto the keywords here in a way, and kind of put them to the panel around citizenship in terms of the qualification to play for a nation. We should maybe listen to our intuitions first. We have a clear sense that a situation like Guinea with 9 Brazilians is wrong. So, you know, maybe one solution is to go back to the model that you have, your 3 classifications in citizenship, and then try to refine that to try and find different ways in which you can identify ways in which types of citizenship belonging don't qualify for the World Cup, maybe, or for national representation, but other ones do, which would account for keeping the Guinea case out, but other ones in. A second question I'd like to raise, or issue maybe, is around identity, and whether there are different types of national identification, or if you like, intensities. Now, I notice, Dario, that you work in Austria. So just to maybe draw a kind of a distinction, if you like. I remember going to Austria many years ago to see Scotland get beat once again, in a friendly, as it happened. And meeting some Austrians, and they were talking about Austria being an absurd country. And as a Scot, I sometimes feel Scotland's a bit absurd as well. Would you ever get that kind of language used in Serbia or Croatia? So there's that kind of question about the intensity of sense of belonging that maybe needs to come out more in the nationalism literature, perhaps. So that's maybe one thing to explore as well, to kind of differentiate types of national identification and what national identity is in different countries. And also, your final one is about refugees. You know, what do we mean by refugees really? You know, who qualifies as a refugee fully? I mean, certainly someone who's fleeing a civil war into Europe is, you could see as a refugee, but what about economic refugees? You know, people who could be classified as economic refugees from places like Kosovo, where it's, you're outside Europe in terms of qualification, you need a visa to get anywhere, there's very high unemployment, you may even be highly qualified, or even come from a very marginal community, and you try to move west illegally to find some work. Aren't you a refugee there as well? So maybe there was a connection between what we spoke about last night, about the connection really between refugees and social justice. You know, ensuring that, you know, people who are excluded but may not qualify as formal refugees according to some tight criteria are actually, you know, refugees from social justice.
Well, since sort of the most direct question, just very, oh, we're getting another question first?
I mean, I'll question. I'll go ahead first, and then I'll ask my question.
Yeah, very, very briefly. So, I mean, the thing that I'd say about sort of the difference between sort of the Austrian understanding of national identity and in Southeastern Europe, and I know some quantitative studies for Austria, but I know them better for former Yugoslavia, and there it just sort of clearly shows, not my own service, but sort of far broader quantitative service, that sport is a central aspect of how one identifies nationhood, both in Croatia and in Serbia. In Bosnia, less so due to the fragmented nature of the country itself. And that's why you would rather struggle to find a similar narrative about one's own nation, particularly within football fandom per se.
Yeah. And just as for the definition of refugees, what I was using for my purposes is just the the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the definition of it being forced from one's homeland by, you know, as a political prisoner or natural disaster or civil war. But you're right, economic. Yeah, it's a convenient, it's a nice definition, but certainly economic refugees could be added to the list. Yes.
Can I ask?
Yeah.
You know, okay, so you touched on something. There were 2 points I want to make. Dario, I was looking at that sort of post-Yugoslavian team, and I was thinking of a pre-Yugoslavian team, and that would have been a World Cup winner when you look at the types of players. And, I mean, it's an incredible assortment of talent. And number 2, the question just there. Okay, I'm deeply troubled by the Qataris because they've bought Neymar, and I'm a huge Barca fan, and I just don't like them. But I did think about all these African players and going to play for this Qatari national team, and they're a form of economic migrants, aren't they? I mean, you know, are we gonna? People have traditionally gone to Western countries looking for better opportunity and things like that. And is that maybe one of the ways we can think about this World Cup Qatari team? I mean, is that fair? As much as I'd like to throw them under the bus, I think I need to pose that question.
Yeah. Okay. So I agree. You know, they can be part, like, for example, we have in the Netherlands we have Moroccan and Turkey migrants, and even, you know, the first generation. You know, I'm not talking about second or third generation, but the first generation, when they work for 5 or 6 or 7 years, you know, they are allowed for Dutch citizenship under the just nexi rule, and the same would apply for that. The difference, I mean, for audiences, so if you ask audiences, the feeling is different. You know, if a state on purpose plays an active role in attracting outsiders to represent the national team, instead of people who are working within the state, and then they or their children become part of that state. So there is a slight issue here, and audiences respond quite emotional on the issue. Sometimes not. I'd like to come back also a little bit on your question about New Guinea. Actually, I agree. I mean, this is maybe it's not a good example. The reason why it's in the paper, it's because there, the former FIFA president Blatter and others realized that Brazilians will play an increasing role in World Cups in general. So his famous quote that we are now organizing World Cups where maybe half of the players actually have their origin in Brazil, what's then the use of organizing World Cups? So he realized that something was at stake. The FIFA rule still is, you know, once you played for the country, you know, you cannot really change it. But for example, the International Athletes Federation, I just talked about the Olympic Games, but they have now pronounced that they, by the end of this year, will change their rules on changing citizens, changing representation different countries. And I'm very curious where they come up with.
I think, yeah, we'll take a few more questions. I saw your hands. Yes.
Thank you very much. It was an amazing panel. My question is for Gilbert. Well, since you show the picture of Diego Costa, it's you are talking about almost man football, but in Equatorial Guinea there is also women football. The women team was all Brazilians that stay like 3 months in Equatorial Guinea and then go back to Brazil for the rest of the year. And they won the African Cup. It was the first after Nigeria. And also in Spain for the indoor soccer, the national team of Spain, all Brazilians. No? So, but I think we have to pick up a concept of Saskia Sassin that is strategic citizenship. Because for them, they continue to be Brazilians. You won't find any identity tie with this Equatorian country, or even for Diego Costa with Spain. Where he is now, he's in Brazil. He lives in a very, very small city, but he prefers to go there than stay in Spain or else. So it's a identity, a football identity that has nothing to do with the self-identity, and it is for a strategic goal to be able to play in a World Cup. Wouldn't be the case, maybe, if he's still Brazilian, and to be able to circulate in the market in Europe. That's what the players told me. They get citizenship to open space for other Brazilians come to the club and to be able to circulate more freely. So it's strategic.
I think it sounds like we're done with the Q&A. So first of all, let's thank our panel once again. We're going to transition. Yeah, we're going to transition to our next panel. We'll come back, I guess, in 10 or 15 minutes, and we'll start up again with panel 2 for today. Thank you.
Το ένα και το άλλο εκεί.